to Zion's banner. We've got it working. All the communities now can chat together. And I can see everybody, and you will be able to too. So this is really exciting. Restream is operating beautifully, and I've recommended it to George. So that's my shout out to Restream. I just need a quick sound check, so if someone can let me know if they're hearing me, that would be great. And we are good to go in just a second here. So I'm just making sure my sound works. There we go. Sound works. Let me take a minute or two and pray for our dear sister Elizabeth, who is noted that my daughter tends to have those type of migraine headaches, and I always feel bad. She goes through a lot of pain, and so I understand. I will turn the volume up. Thanks for that, and I will also do so in OBS. OBS is set to a little lower because I almost blew my eardrums out a little, just a little sensitive to the sound. So, still hearing me okay? I'm just checking because I'm not getting the advanced sound meters that I should be getting here. Input device. I'm going to check the input device here and make sure that I'm getting what I should be getting here. Testing. Yep. Okay. We're good. Okay. So everything is there. Let me take a minute or two because I know my daughter suffers from them, and I'm really sorry. Also, if the headache is really bothering, one thing you can do is turn it down. And if you're in a room, turning the lights down sometimes helps a little with migraines. I'm not an expert, but my daughter tells me the dark room sometimes helps a little bit so that you'd be seeing only the screen, but you get a little less light. Or thank you for Elizabeth, who is doing a lot of moderating these days and is a real help to those of us who are online, to apologetics, to the sharing of the gospel. And Lord, I pray that the migraine would ease, and that if there are any triggers that she needs to discover that tend to kick these off, I pray that you'd help her to find them and then be able to work around them. Thank you for her. Thank you for everybody that's popping in tonight. And it's just so exciting to have people. This is going to be a really good broadcast. By the way, just a quick word. I'm thinking about a special Zoom broadcast with a gentleman who's a Muslim apologist on intersections in apologetics. And so we're thinking about how to set that up. He is Eddie Youssef is in Michigan and I'm here, but we're thinking about a special program. And I'm also thinking about a special program with a guest who will discuss cultural Marxism. So we've got some things planned where I'm going to actually try to come out of my shell and actually end up having guests. And so this is going to be a new thing for me because I'm a little less used to interviewing, but I'm excited about the possibilities. God's going to stretch me in this in ways I have not yet imagined. So let's get to our should work. Now the mic should be up. There we go. Sorry about that. It must have come loose. I'm going to deal with it that way. I preached on it. I will be guilty of what the detractor calls the missionary interpretation. You'll see the way he spits kind of the word missionary out. Now, he is a lot more amenable, more rational than Tovia is. But he's still going to dislike and understand that it's very hard for those of us who share the gospel with Jewish people, because the term missionary has some really negative connotations, and he's always attacking based on that visceral sort of feel. This is a group called Jews for Judaism. It's what would be called a polemic group. They would call themselves anti-missionaries. They apparently don't pay attention to the fact that the first followers of Christianity were Jews who proclaimed Jesus' message. But they are terribly concerned about the spread of Christianity among Jewish people. Unlike Tovia Singer, they do not spend a lot of time attacking Christians and telling them to leave the faith. So we're going to get to hear from this gentleman and deal with these features of Daniel. You will be able to see the chat from anywhere tonight, and so those who are with us from Facebook can chime in, and you will be able to see all those sources. So I'm excited about that. We can have a Q&A after. I'm in the process of working on getting this to work Zoom. It can be done, and then maybe, I know there's some interest, we can actually play with people coming on to answer and talk and explain their question. So it's just a matter of, do I go from Zoom to OBS or OBS to Zoom? So I'm just working that out. Enough of that. It's time to get busy. It's time to get into our lesson. We've got a lot of ground to cover. Some of the writing is a little smaller because I had to include large amounts of text. The PowerPoints are available. I will let you in on a secret. If you're having trouble seeing these, I try to do the best, and this will probably be one of the slides that will be a little difficult. Other ones will be better. I still work on that, but you can always have the PowerPoint in front of you or look at it later, and that's why I make those available. There are no infographics to this, so I'm not avoiding giving folks infographics. It's just that some messages have infographics, others don't lend themselves. I think we will probably have someone we deal with next week, because we'll be dealing with cantillation marks, and it may be wise to have those. The first part of this is just a stating of Daniel 70 weeks of sevens. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about this. Now, the first question we're going to deal with is this passage messianic? Before we hear from our detractor about the way this passage is misused, I think it is wise to go ahead and decide whether this messianic passage is, messianic. Surely I believe it is, but I want to give you some reasons that you could use with someone like this gentleman from Jews for Judaism that we're going to hear from. By the way, this clip was recommended to me by someone. I did not find it. So if you were the one that recommended the clip, and I'm trying to think back, we're dealing with that clip. So let's get it messianic, and then let's hear what he says about it. But if it's not messianic, there'd be no need for us to go into his objections to it speaking about Jesus, because it would be irrelevant anyway. 70 weeks, you'll notice in parentheses, of years, we'll talk about why that's the case, have been decreed on Jerusalem from the day of the first destruction in the days of Zedekiah until it will be destroyed a second time to terminate the transgression. Now you're saying that's not the way my Bible reads. No, that's the way RASHI reads. Aha! I pulled one. I pulled out Rashi's commentary. Okay? Because I want you to see that when we ask whether it's messianic, do we have reasons
that the Jewish community should believe it's messianic? Does my detractor have reasons to believe it's messianic? So no, this is not your Bible. This is Rashi, the Jewish scholar, translating out Daniel's 70 weeks of sevens. So let's go back. 70 weeks of years are decreed on Jerusalem from the day of the first destruction in the days of Zedekiah until it will be destroyed a second time, to terminate the transgression and to end sin, so that Israel will receive the complete retribution in the exile of Titus and subjugation, in order that their transgression should be terminated, their sins should end, and their iniquity should be expiated, in order to bring about the eternal righteousness, and anoint upon them the holy of holies, the ark, the altar, and the holy vessels, which they will bring to them through King Messiah. The number of 70 weeks is 490 years. The Babylonian captivity was 70 years, and the second temple stood 420 years. Note carefully that Rashi's comments that this prophecy involves the time of restoration brought about through King Messiah, indicating that it is not only Christians who see clear messianic overtones in this prophecy. The difference, however, is that Christians have a clear basis for the messianic interpretation of Daniel 9:24 through 27, namely that Messiah died for the sins of the world during the very time specified by Daniel, whereas Rashi simply pens the reference to King Messiah at the end of the passage without any explanation. Now, that's Michael Brown's commentary on Rashi's commentary. Now, why did I do this? Because if someone tells you Daniel 9:24 through 27 is not messianic and they are a Jewish person, you need to ask them why Rashi considers it to be a passage about Messiah. So when the detractor comes and says to you clearly, this is not messianic, you have good course to say, well, we can discuss whether this is about Messiah, but you as a Jewish person can't say that's a Christian interpretation. You must acknowledge that it's also a Jewish interpretation by Jewish scholars. And that's why I did that. Because the argument will sometimes be used that Christians have made up that this is about Messiah. And so right from the get-go, I want to say you have every reason to consider it messianic in terms of Jewish thought. All right? Now, one could say that Rashi didn't know what he was talking about, but if your Jewish detractor says that, you say, well, then I guess you need to throw out the Jewish writings and Jewish thought along with Christian thought. And so what do you believe and think? But I did that very deliberately. This is Rashi's translation of Daniel. Now, we see some problems here where Rashi seems to be figuring things in, but the point is this was a recognized Jewish translation, or Jewish interpretation might be better, of Daniel's 70 weeks of sevens. Now, why did Rashi say sevens of years, and why do I teach sevens of years? Because the passage starts out, and let me read it to you now without Rashi, without the Rashi gloss, okay? I'm going to go there and I'm going to read it to you, and then you're going to see why some might question the whole sevens thing. I'm not going to go ahead and try to bring Logos up tonight because I'm a little concerned about pushing things a little bit too much. 70 weeks are determined for your people and your holy city to finish the transgressions, to put an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be rebuilt again, and the wall in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off, not for himself, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end will be with a flood until the end of the war. Desolations are decreed. Then he shall confirm a covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. On the wing of abomination shall come one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now that is a mouthful. I'm using the New King James. Our detractor's going to have major problems with the King James. We're going to deal with one of those tonight, and then we're going to deal with the other where he wants to put a punctuation mark in based on the cantillation marks, and we'll discuss what cantillation marks are, why he'd like to put a semicolon where he'd like to put it, and what that all means to us, and whether we could go ahead and not necessarily agree. All right. But what you will see is that even in the King James, you will see 70 weeks. You will have a 1 there that will further give explanation. Why don't we consider just 70 weeks of days? Okay. Which you could indeed do. Why don't we do that? What's going on here that causes us to think that it's weeks of years? Now, understand that in Jewish thinking, what we simply have in the Hebrew is groupings of 77s, and that's why the King James translates it that way. Because in the Hebrew, if you're going to translate it very woodenly, you would say 77s. But what you need to understand here is the background of Daniel. So to understand the background of Daniel 25 and on, you have to go back to Daniel 9, the first couple verses. Now that gives us the context for the vision, and I'm going to lay Daniel out a little bit here. I didn't do it in the slides, and then I will go to Michael Brown's comments, okay, which will back up what I'm saying. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, is the way I would pronounce it. You may have Xerxes, you may have Ahasuerus, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of years specified by the word of the Lord through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So the background of this is 70 years. And so Daniel recognizes, because he's doing his devotions in Jeremiah that morning, or at that time, that there has been a decree. From that decree, there has been a period of time set aside that is a multiple of the 70 years. Later on, when he gets the prophecy, understands it's a multiple of the 70 years, but he's thinking 70 years to begin with. That's my point. He's thinking 70 years because he's reading Daniel. He starts reading Daniel and he says, aha, the Jewish exile is coming to an end. And then all the way through, pretty much the rest of the chapter leading up to Daniel 9:25, he starts confessing the sins of Israel because he does not want Israel to blow it. He wants them to leave the exile, to go back to the land, for God to pour his goodness upon them, his love back upon them, to prosper them. And he realizes that just as they got in trouble before, they could get in trouble again. And so he intercedes for Israel based on the fact the Babylonian captivity is coming to an end. And so that's what he ends up doing. Now that gives us the background. He was triggered by reading the captivity was coming to an end, and that captivity was supposed to last 70 years. In praying and interceding, he is given more revelation. Now, Michael Brown's going to comment on this in Answering Jewish Objections, page 87. Volume 3. This is the background. Daniel, one of the godliest men spoken of in Scripture, was as a young man among the first exiles brought to Babylon, almost 20 years before the temple was destroyed in 586. You'll notice BCE, it's the same as BC. It's a more Jewish way of stating it. Don't fret it right now. He was a very old man, having spent almost all his life in exile, and he had read in the book of Jeremiah that Judah's exile was to last 70 years. The 70 years were almost completed, at least the beginning of, with the time of Daniel's own exile, 604 BCE. So he gave himself to broken-hearted prayer and fasting, pleading with God to have mercy on his scattered people and restore them to their homeland. That's the background. So when we deal in 70 weeks of sevens, we know that the years are in mind. It's weeks of years. 70 weeks of years. So it's the 70 multiplied by a factor of 7 that we're dealing with. This gives us the reason because Jews began to count by sevens. That was natural for them to do. And it was natural for them to do. Okay, just some resources being thrown up there. It was natural for them to do because remember the way their week worked. Okay? I'm not familiar with the article, but that's interesting. Do understand that I don't view that 490 as being completely. I have a view about the clock stopping, which is pretty natural. So if your article is on the preteristic side, there are reasons I would disagree with it, but I'm not going to cover that in that broadcast. I'm not trying to get in anyone's way. If it's a great article, it's a great article. It's just I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know its contents. So if you are reading that article, it would be interesting for me to go back and see what's said. But what we have to deal with is that 490. So we know it's weeks of years, and that's what I'm getting at. Jews were counting by 7. Now, Michael Brown asks the right question. The right question would be, do the phrases associated with those 7 years point to Jesus and his work and the events of his day? That's the right question to ask. In other words, if you're going to ask whether this is about Messiah and Jesus fulfilled this prophecy, then what you have to do is go back to the statements that are made as to the purpose of the 70 weeks of 7. Okay? Now, the Hebrew is very clear. What you have is a series of infinitives. Now, these are infinitive constructs. There are 2 types of infinitives in Hebrew. There's an infinitive of emphasis. God says to Adam, in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. It's usually translated die. One could translate it a little bit more woodenly. That's an infinitive of emphasis. Okay? But there's something called an infinitive construct. Now that's used to indicate the purpose or result of something. So what are these years going to accomplish? What is their purpose? Okay. So let's look at what they're to accomplish and see whether Jesus' work and person do that. Okay? One is to finish or complete the transgression or sin. Now, I want you to notice something here. There's a definite article in front of sin. Now, technically, the word sin there is in the plural feminine. To finish or complete the transgression or sin, or you could say the sins or the transgressions. The definite article. I'm sorry, the definite article is not there. So again, it writes the same way: to complete sin or transgression. All right. Because I'm looking at this with you. Ule kefar, and that should be on. Okay, to atone for iniquity. Bo ule habi habi Sadiq olamim. Okay? To cause to come or bring in everlasting righteousness. And then we have to seal up the vision and prophecy. So word we get, okay? Chatam, ulechatom, hatom, and then you have the word for vision, hazon, vinavi. Okay, to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, it is the word we get Mashiach from, because that word also is the word anoint. Okay? And so those are the 7 purposes or results of those 70 weeks. So 70 weeks have to bring those events about. And I would say they're the purpose. It's the reason the 70 events are, because they're decreed for this purpose. So does Jesus' life relate to these? Now, this is the right question. Ule kafar aon. All right, Jesus' death to atone. Well, Jesus' death atones for sin. Now, if your opponent says Jesus' death doesn't atone for sin, then you have to say, okay, now it's for you to show me evidence. Okay? To finish transgression. Now, what Michael Brown points out is the way to understand this word finish, okay, it probably means to bring sin to its ugly climax. Because someone will argue that, well, wait a minute, after Jesus came, sin didn't end. We still have sin today. Well, that's not necessarily the way we should understand finish in the Hebrew. So he says this probably means to bring sin to its completion. And if we go back to that word, it can have that idea. Okay? Now, one of the reasons that he then cites Matthew 23, 34, and 35 to sort of back this up, when he says, he's citing Jesus, therefore indeed I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some of whom you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that may come upon you the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between temple and altar. Now, Jesus is very clear that that generation is going to fill up or bring sin to its ugliest and worst expression. And so when we go back to that Hebrew word, it can have that idea. So when we're looking at the previous word, and I should have had the Hebrew there, okay, to finish, it can have the idea of to complete. And so it can have the idea of completing sin, bringing it to its worst case scenario. Okay? Does Jesus' life point to that? Yes. The ignoring of God's revelation reaches its greatest expression in Israel's not receiving her Messiah. Not receiving the greatest one who was sent to them. And so Jesus' life points to that. So someone says, well, sin didn't end. No, but sin was completed. Okay, sin reached its completion, its fullness in this. Because what could be worse than Messiah being rejected? I'm thinking very much of just taking a second. I'm really tempted to put Logos up at this point, but I don't think we have the time to do it. Let's move on, because there are ones that, even if you wanted to take a little exception with that, and I'd say, well, the understanding of bringing sin to its completion is a legitimate. So let's go on and just bring that. And maybe next week, I will just do a little aside and bring up that verse and just bring up the lexical reference for you. But Michael Brown is very clear and no slouch when it comes to Hebrew. Let's move on. Now, Hiphiel infinitive. Now, this is really funny. Let me tell you a funny story. This is a story I've told many times. If you want to express something being causative, you don't necessarily have a separate verb for that in Hebrew. This is where the idea of stems come in, okay, or binyan. And so here's what we've got here. We've got a case in which the word to come is in a stem that means to cause to come. Okay, it's a causative stem, the Hiphiel. All right? And so that's the way you say brought, you say to cause to come. And I always translated that woodenly in Hebrew class. And my Hebrew professor would always say, yeah, we have a word for that, Jeff. But this is an infinitive, to cause to come, or to cause to be brought in, or to bring in everlasting righteousness. Okay? Michael Brown quotes Archer here as far as this being, you could have it two ways. You could have this phrase refer to the culmination of Messiah's work when he comes and establishes kingdom, or you can have it refer to the gift of righteousness, which is mentioned by Paul in Romans 5:17 in reference to Jesus' work. Okay. Either one would not destroy that Jesus' life and death point to these things. He's the one who's going to bring in the kingdom. He has secured that kingdom with his death. All right, now let's hear our detractor. Oops. And I'm going to bring in our detractor by not trying to do it, and I probably could yet, but I'm going to go to our detractor score.
An English rendering of that Hebrew word. For example, my Hebrew name is Yitzchak. Yitzchak, which is difficult to say for people that don't speak Hebrew. They choke on the cha part. So Yitzchak becomes Isaac. Right? It's an English version of the Hebrew word, but Isaac is not a translation of Yitzchak. Yitzchak means he will laugh. So usually the King James translation translates the Hebrew word. Whenever it occurs in the Bible, and again, dozens and dozens of times, the King James translation always renders Mashiach as anointed, or an anointed one. That's what the word means. Mashiach means that someone or something is anointed. Oil has been applied to it. There are only two exceptions, two places in the entire Bible where the King James translators render the Hebrew word Mashiach just simply as Messiah. They don't translate it. They give you the English version, the English equivalent of the Hebrew word Mashiach. The question is why? Why all of a sudden, after dozens and dozens of times when they've always consistently translated Mashiach as anointed, why is this left basically as the Hebrew, left as the Messiah, as Mashiach? Second problem. You all know that Hebrew letters do not have lowercase and uppercase. There's no capital letters in Hebrew. And yet, what you'll notice the King James translators did was to capitalize the word Messiah, right? So it doesn't just have the word Messiah here instead of anointed, but it capitalizes it. Again, we're going to understand in a moment why this license was taken. And the third problem is that what the King James translator did in verse 25 was to insert the definite article where it doesn't appear in the Hebrew. The Hebrew does not say ha Mashiach, the Messiah. The Hebrew simply says Mashiach Nagid, an anointed prince, an anointed ruler. But what the King James translator did here was to basically insert
Okay, he decided to stop there, and so I'm going to get right back to you in just a sec here. I ended up not taking all of him. We're going to take more of him next week, so I'm going to jump back for you here and pull up OBS, close this, and go back to our split screen. There we are. There's our detractor. Let me move on here. Okay. So that's what we've got. Okay. Okay, we've got some really good stuff on the board, and we're going to be able to see that. Okay, someone's listened to this rabbi several times now. Jared says, I know one of the gifted scholars died before the King James was translated, but he didn't translate the Old Testament, New Testament Apocrypha with a deep knowledge of the Greek and Hebrew. I'm not going to argue from the excellencies of the King James. I'm going to argue that the apologetic points that he's making aren't very valid. Okay? I'm going to do it one of several ways. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and use the Stone edition. Okay. Now, what's interesting about this is the Stone edition is the English translation of the Hebrew Scriptures that is accepted by the Orthodox Jews. Okay. And I'm going to go to Michael Brown, who points something out about the Stone edition. Okay, the Stone edition renders it the anointed one, not unanointed one. In other words, the accepted translation of Daniel by Orthodox Judaism does not translate it an anointed one. It translates it exactly like the King James in the sense that the definite article is used, even though the definite article is not there in the Hebrew. Now, someone has to ask, okay, if this is some dirty trick that the King James is playing, then why does the Stone edition allow the word Mashiach in the passage to be translated with the definite article when it's not there? By the way, the Stone edition may translate it anointed one, okay, which is another one of his complaints. But the word Messiah also means anointed one. Okay, so the word Messiah does translate to the same thing as anointed one translates to. The Messiah is a particular anointed one. So when they say, why doesn't they just translate it instead of with the title? The title translates to the same meaning. Okay. Now, the reason the Stone edition does this, that Michael Brown points out, is because the Hebrew language can specify a particular person or event without using the definite article. You don't need the definite article. Okay? That's right. Someone just pointed that out, a definite person. In fact, that's amplified by the fact that Nagid is used with it. Messiah, the Prince, is specifying a particular individual. And so that's there. But this is a recognized standard grammars, and in certain phrases, virtually all translations, it's not just any anointed one, but the prophecy describes but a particular anointed one. Some translators, both Christian and Jewish, feel the concept is best expressed by the word the to identify the particular subject. All right? Exactly what's being said here. Now, Michael Brown's just pointing this feature grammatically of Hebrew out. But beyond this, Jewish people know this. This is where this gets annoying. Okay? This is where this gets annoying. To go ahead and make this claim is problematic. Okay? Because the word Mashiach is used in later sources as a proper name, as in the Jewish bumper sticker, we want Mashiach now. For many centuries in the Jewish mind, the word Mashiach does not just simply mean unanointed one, but rather the anointed one. Okay, in the 13 articles of Maimonides, okay, I believe with perfect faith in the Messiah, though he tarry, yet shall I wait for him. One doesn't need to say the anointed one. It's not translated in the articles of Maimonides. It's not translated on the bumpers. We want an anointed one now. Is that the idea here? This is not somehow strange terminology. Okay, and the Stone edition does the same thing. So why does the Stone edition do this if this is a Christian trick? But let me show you there are cases in which the definite article doesn't need to be used. Okay, Elohim does not necessarily always in every context mean God with a capital G. It can mean small g gods or divine beings in general. Now, I pointed that out by going to Lexham's theological word book. I could have gone to other lexical aids. This is not uncommon. The word Elohim is translated God, small g, in several passages. This is not a new idea. So let's go ahead and ask the question. If the definite article is always needed to indicate a particular person, then what happens with our Bible? Bereshi bara Elohim et Shemayim v'ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. No. There's no definite article. There's no definite article in Genesis. I just quoted it to you from the Hebrew. There's no definite article. In the beginning, God created. Bereshi bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created. There's no definite article. Elohim is used. Okay? There's no definite article at all. So let's see now. There's no definite article, so I have to assume that we don't necessarily mean the one true God. Okay? We have to mean any God. So in the beginning, a God created the heavens and earth. I mean, there's no definite article. So it doesn't necessarily mean the one true God. And I'm just pointing out that Hebrew does this in places. Okay? The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water. Okay, you could say that's specific. It's part of a phrase. Okay, but let's go further. Then God, and I really want to pull this up because it's just so fun to go ahead and actually pull the Hebrew right up. Okay, but then, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. No, I'm sorry, there's no definite article before Elohim. Then a God, not the specific God who made everything, right? Because there's no definite article there. And there was light. And this goes on completely through Genesis. You don't see the definite article. But it's always translated capital G. It's always translated a specific deity or divine being, not just any divine being. And then a God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, right? No definite article. And I'm just applying the rule that the detractors applying. Okay? He doesn't complain about the King James capitalizing the G and referring to a specific person in Genesis at all, even though the definite article isn't there. But he does object to it in Daniel. Okay? And so the question is, why all of a sudden is he objecting? See, that's what I would be asking. Why are you objecting now and you've never objected before? Why not be consistent? Wherever there's not a definite article, we obviously have a general reference. Okay? If his argument was true that a specific Hebrew noun always requires the definite article to be referring to a specific person, okay, or a specific Hebrew noun always requires a definite article, we'd have to consider a God as a reference to any God because there's no definite article used in the Hebrew. He's not consistently applying the grammatical feature. He's getting mad at the King James for doing it in one case and not another. Okay. Did Jewish sources consider this? So we've talked about this, okay? The stone considers it a reference to Messiah, the anointed one. Rashi uses the term King Messiah in the passage. Okay? Alexeum Septuagint. Now, I've gone to the Septuagint. This is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. This is an English Septuagint. It's part of Logos Bible software. After 7 periods of 7 and 62 periods of 7, an anointed place will be removed and will not, and the kingdom from among the nations will despoil the city and the holy place, along with the anointed one. And his end comes with a destructive anger until the set time of the consummation. There will be war upon war. Now, it doesn't sound like your English Bible, okay? But here's what I want you to notice. When the Septuagint translates it, they translate it as the anointed one. Which, by the way, translates back to Hebrew as Ha-Mashiach. Or, since the definite article is not needed, as the Septuagint points out, it would just be Mashiach. Because we know the definite article doesn't need to be there. And the Septuagint takes the word Mashiach and places the definite article there, just like the King James does. How interesting. But the Septuagint was written centuries before the King James, and the Septuagint was translated by Jewish scholars, not by English Christians. Isn't that interesting? So maybe the King James was influenced by the Greek Septuagint or the Latin translation of the Greek Septuagint. Maybe there's a reason the King James translates it the way it does. Because maybe that's the way the Septuagint and other writings and other exegetes clearly understood it at the time. Maybe that's what's really going on here. In fact, I stuck the Greek up. Charisma kai uk estai kai basilia. I'm reading here. Okay. Ethnon feth era ton. Boy, my Greek teacher would hate me tonight. Okay. Polin kai ton. Hagion meta ton. But what's interesting is the last two words. Ton. To Christu. To Christu. Christ is used. Wait a minute. Let's follow this through. The Jewish Bible is translated into Greek. You following this? The King James and English translations connect back to that Greek. They may have gone through the Latin. The word the Christ is there in the Jewish translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Oh, is that King James people again? How did that happen? This is the Septuagint using the word the Christ. So maybe the King James got the idea of putting the Messiah there, okay, because it is the equivalent in Hebrew of the Christ, which is Greek, which was translated from the Hebrew scriptures by Jewish scholars. So if the idea of the Christ came into the mind of King James people, they probably came into the mind of King James people through the Jewish translation of the Hebrew scriptures done by Jewish scholars. I mean, that's a legitimate inference. So, Rabbi, are you unaware that the Stone translation translates it as the Anointed One, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Mashiach. Okay? That's the way they translate Mashiach. That Rashi translated it as the Anointed One. In fact, he translated it as King Messiah. So he didn't have any problem with Mashiach being translated as Messiah. That's Rashi. Okay? Had no problem with it. And the King James people could have gotten it very easily from the Septuagint and not from some evil plan. Okay? In fact, I stuck Rashi up. Let's revisit Rashi and look at this. I want you to see this in the actual Hebrew. And I put the words in red so that you can actually see it, because I want you to be able to see this in the Hebrew. And I want you to notice that this is the translation that Rashi takes. Okay? Now someone's going to say, but Rashi doesn't consider both people to be Messiah in the passage. So he takes one use of the word Mashiach to refer to Cyrus and the other use of Mashiach to refer to the anointed prince. Okay? Which is a little weird. Okay? Which is a little weird. I'll admit it. It's a little weird. But I want you to notice that if you go with Rashi, okay, and you even take only one of these as being King Messiah, notice that neither of these have the definite article. So what my detractor is essentially saying is, in two cases where the Hebrew definite article is not used, Rashi is wrong for using one as King Messiah and actually translating it as, considering it as King Messiah. You see that as the cursor goes around? See, Rashi would have to be wrong. Not the King James Bible, not the missionaries. Rashi would have to be wrong. Okay? Because Rashi considers at least one of those Mashiach not to be any unanointed prince, but to be the Messiah himself. Isn't that interesting? So the King James is not doing anything that Rashi doesn't do. It's just Rashi doesn't do it in the same place that the King James does it. Or the better way to put it is, Rashi doesn't do it in both cases, whereas the King James is actually more consistent than Rashi is. And there's Rashi in the English. Okay, King Messiah. But there's no definite article. And when Rashi is translated, he's translated as Messiah. Okay. Now, this translation was rendered by A.J. Rosenberg. Okay. But I want you to see that look what Rashi does. And Rashi puts king there. There's no melech there in either case. Rashi understands Mashiach to be the Messiah, and he has no problem with it. So it isn't a King James trick. Okay? Rashi does not need the definite article before the word anointed in Daniel 9:24 through 27. Obviously, he doesn't believe that it should be, he believes that, that it isn't needed. I mean, you're stuck with either Rashi like being a Jewish missionary, or you're kind of stuck with Rashi not knowing, or you're stuck with you're not paying attention to Rashi, because Rashi doesn't even follow that rule. So let's talk about drawing some conclusions, and I hope I was pretty clear throughout this whole thing. The context of Daniel 9:24 through 27 is clearly messianic. It's attested to by at least one medieval Jewish source. The purpose of the 70 weeks of sevens is clearly consistent with the work of Jesus. You can discuss how he brings in everlasting righteousness through his death, or through his death initiating the eventual bringing of his kingdom. Okay? I mean, you can make it about his death initiated the bringing in of the future kingdom, and when he brings in that future kingdom, it's accomplished. like it's prophecy that will be accomplished still. Or you could say his death brought in everlasting righteousness in terms of the gift of righteousness that is given. In either case, it still fits Jesus' life and work. The definite article doesn't need to appear before the term Mashiach for it to refer to King Messiah. We know that from Rashi. We know that from the Septuagint. Okay? And Rashi's perfectly comfortable. Why is he comfortable with what this guy's uncomfortable with? We need to ask ourselves that. Why is Rashi so comfortable with what this guy is so uncomfortable with? And should Rashi's comfortability indicate something about the freedom within Jewish thought to take it that way? We see here that the definite article doesn't need to be there. Now, I'll admit I probably should have pulled out that word related to finishing sin, but I was perfectly willing to take Michael Brown on that. So that's a mea culpa on my part. I want to give you the best I can give you, and I figured we only had. Yeah, I also want to be a little careful. I could get so deep in my Hebrew out of love for it that I could lose track of myself, and I don't want to do that either. Now I can now go, and we have this, and go to OBS because now this will actually work. There's the Restream chat right up there working tonight. I am so excited. Now we did not pull anyone in from the Facebook page or from Periscope. So you guys are awesome. And I don't know where those other people are. Okay. Thank you, Radical Love, for that. This was a little complicated. Next week, we're going to be a little more complicated. I'm sorry, because we got to deal with cancellation marks and the case of the missing semicolon. So we're going to have to deal with that a little bit more. And so that will be a little complicated. So you guys are going to learn something about trope and cantillation marks and how that would divide the time period up. But that's where we're at. Thursday, we're back in Matthew, dealing with Jesus's arguments related to rabbinical tradition, how he viewed the oral law, and our Nash of Hebrew. So that will be exciting. And so that will be really good. And that's where we are at. So I'm going to go to OBS. The chat should